Hi, everybody.
Dubai, very nice. All right, everybody. Well, we're going to start here, but feel free, yes, please do keep introducing yourselves. If you're joining us now, if you've been here, let us know where you're joining from. We love to see how we have participation from all around the globe, all across the US and more. That's what this conversation is for. It's for all of you who are in education leadership to get some insights, some tips, some tactics to support your change management and, in fact, your change leadership in your organizations. So, this is the Change Management Masterclass session. We're going to go ahead and get into it. So, it's my pleasure here to welcome our guest expert today, Richard Gerver. Richard came to prominence when he was a head teacher in the UK. He turned around a failing school in under 2 years, won a variety of plaudits globally, and has been referred to as the Walt Disney of the classroom. So I'm going to maybe have him tell us more about that. But Richard has gone on to win a multitude of international awards, including a UNESCO award for leadership and innovation, National Teaching Awards, and Head Teacher of the Year. But Richard, first of all, I'd like to welcome you in here, and would love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, particularly tell our participants here, right, about your history working as an educator, as a teacher, a head teacher, and then how you got into the work you do now with innovation and change and authoring, speaking, all the variety of things you do. But I would love to have you put in your own words.
Of course. Thanks, Ross. Hello, everybody. Thank you. And by the way, thank you for taking the time out wherever you are in the world. It's amazing to see so many different locations. And as Ross said, please make sure that you put questions in the chat, or if you want to interact, let me know. So yeah, I mean, my story is it's an accidental one, really. Nothing in my life has been pre-planned. So I started teaching at the start of the 1990s. And I know, thank you for those of you that haven't seen me before. I know I don't look old enough to have been teaching that long, and it's very kind of you to say so. So I started teaching at the start of the 1990s. In elementary education, in primary schools in the UK, in state education, and very quickly realized that it was the passion of my life. And I thought that would be my career forever. I came from, prior to starting teaching, I came from an arts background. I was passionate even then about writing and performance, and you'll see why those things become relevant as we go through the webinar, I think, and also the trajectory of my career. So I started teaching in an area of severe social deprivation in the middle of the UK, in the early 1990s. Became a school principal very young. And really by accident. I had been seconded at the time by the British government. And for those of you that are across the world, you may know that unlike in the US, for example, education is very much controlled by federal government rather than state government. So I was seconded by the federal government during my career, actually, when I was an assistant principal, to design a program to remotivate, specifically remotivate demotivated boys in reading and writing. And as part of that program, had to gather a number of target schools, schools that were failing throughout the UK, to be involved in our program. One of which was a large urban primary elementary school, large for the UK anyway. We had just under, well, between 500 and 600 kids. And they were one of the target schools. I walked in to get them involved in my project, and fell in love with the place. Just a bit of context. This school that I'd fallen in love with had been in failure and decline for over a decade. It had had 8 school principals in 10 years. The last school principal was going through ill health capability, and so they were looking for a new full-time principal. I can't explain to you why I fell in love with the community in the school on my first visit, but I did. To cut a very long story short, and if you want to know more, I'm sure you can ask later on. I applied for the job and got it. I was in very early 30s, 31 actually. And I got the job not because I was a superstar or I had any talent, which is something you'll all learn about me in the hour we've got together. You'll come off at the end, and I promise you'll be thinking he has no discernible talent or knowledge about anything, actually. And the only reason I got the job was I found out after I signed the contract with the local government officer that I was actually the only candidate. Which takes you from, that moment you get a promotion you've always wanted and you feel like a hero. And especially you become a school principal and you think, wow, I'm a school principal. People are going to look at me different. And then you realize the only reason you got the job was basically because you were breathing. Well, that was what happened. Anyway, I found out very quickly why I was the only candidate, because I was the only person kind of eligible in the area who didn't know that the government at the time in the UK had listed it under what it called the Phoenix program. Now, the Phoenix program in the UK at the time was a program designated for schools that had been habitually failing for a very, very long time, as I said, over a decade in this case, and was proving impossible to shift or change. So the Phoenix program meant when you got to the top of the list, your school would be closed down, everybody would be fired, the entire staff, the board, everyone. They would rebrand the school, give the school a new name. In the UK, as you know, we wear uniforms in most of our schools, state schools in particular. You would be given a new uniform, new badge, new name, new board, new staff, and you'd relaunch and start afresh. And anyway, I found out Grange, this school, was on that list, but only after I signed my contract. Anyway, what then ensued was, and again, we might get into the grist of this as we go through, Ross, was we had nothing to lose, basically. The worst that could happen to our school community is what we were slated for anyway, which was closure, everyone being fired. And so I went in there with two very powerful characteristics, I think, of a young principal. I had a mix of arrogance and ignorance. I was arrogant enough to believe I knew we could make a difference, and I was ignorant enough to have no idea what could happen to us if it all went wrong. But what I did know was my whole career had been about kids. My whole career had been teaching in areas of social deprivation. And I fell in love with this school because I knew there was something about this place that could be magical. To cut the story very short, within 18 months, the school wasn't closed down, even though we would have reached the top of the list by then. And as Ross had kindly said, we'd won a World Education Award at UNESCO. Our academic results had doubled inside of 18 months. And the school was suddenly seen as a beacon of something very, very different, because we'd thrown the rule book away and reinvented the way we were going to do learning with our kids. During that period of time, and actually just towards the end of that period of time, I bumped into a man who went on to become my mentor, professional guide, and ultimately the person responsible for me leaving my job as a principal, a man that I'm sure will be known by many of you, and that was an extraordinary human being, Sir Ken Robinson. Ken and I met at a conference in the UK. This was before he became the TED phenomenon that he became, so I was very lucky. I got in at the ground floor. Anyway, we talked over dinner one night at an event. We kind of realized there was such a mutual love and understanding and passion that he became my mentor and guide for the next few years. And eventually, after 7 years of leading the school, he said, Richard, I think it's time for you to leave. I think it's time for you to leave, and I think it's time for you to share your story with a wider audience, because what you've got to say and how you've done it, I think, has real resonance for people. And that's how my career of the last 2 decades began, which was as a speaker and author. He persuaded me in the end to leave. He took me under his wing. He introduced me to people to help me build that profile and that career, to get me my first publishing deal. You can imagine his mentorship and his guidance was opening doors for me that most people could never get towards. But I was living a life where I felt like a constant fraud all the time. I thought, my God, when is it the day that's going to come that people are going to go, is that it, Richard? Anyway, I thought when I left the school, my career would be centered wholly around education for whatever period of time I was out doing this stuff. But very quickly, things happened because I left Grange just around the time of the global financial crisis. And I started to work as a speaker in that context. And what happened was really interesting because the corporate world was in meltdown. Global financial crisis was hitting. They'd all spent millions of dollars on change programs run by the big, management consultancy firms around the world, and none of them were prepared for the real uncertainty of what they were dealing with. And so, as a speaker, I was in the right place at the right time because they were sick of hearing from Olympians and multimillionaires and entrepreneurs and former politicians. And my story, I suppose, was different and relevant and resonant because it was about human beings. And so, very quickly, I found myself working in a much broader context around rather than just education. But throughout that career, everything always comes back to that same narrative. Ross, a number of years ago, helped me create a podcast called The Learning Bridge. And the whole philosophy really is my philosophy, which is we don't talk enough about the bridge between education and employment. We don't prepare young people well enough for what really is happening in the life after education. And as a result, so much of what I see and deal with now in my life, having written a number of books and spoken around the world to a whole host of different groups of people, is that it's coming home to roost because so much of the human response and reflex that we've lived through since the global financial crisis, then, of course, the pandemic, the wars across the world, the political polarization, everything that's happening in between, and on top of that, the maelstrom of technological advance is what is it's exposed is we are so ill prepared to deal with a life and a world of change and uncertainty. And so that's where I find myself now. Sorry, Ross, that was a very long-winded introduction.
It was a wonderful introduction, and I'm going to flip your self-concept a little bit by telling you you were also the only candidate for the webinar today, but for different reasons. It's because you were the only person that was, the best person to speak to this topic of change management, which we know is so critical to leaders in education in particular, in all fields, but certainly in the education field, those who are dealing with change coming at them from all angles, right, and preparing young people for navigating and thriving in change that's going to keep accelerating and never ending. So would actually love to start right with that, with defining change management. I've also heard you refer to it as change leadership, right? But really just giving that definition around what is it that we're talking about here today? What does it mean?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to be contentious right from the start because one of the things I have a problem with is the term change management. Because management to me, and this isn't to belittle management is hugely important in any organization at any level, in any way, shape, or form. But management in many ways is about compliance. That's the perception, right? So people who manage, and we have to, what we do is we're managing people to make sure they're compliant against the system structures, processes that we're putting in place, and particularly top end down. And you see that in every organization in the world. And as I say, that's really important. But change, if we're serious about creating a culture of sustainable change, we have to talk about change leadership, because change management is about making sure people are doing the things they've been told to do. And that's part of the problem. And we'll come back to that as we go on. And certainly part of that feeling of powerlessness that we feel in so many contexts, and specifically in education. We have for generations been fed up of people above us telling us what to do and how to do it, and then putting that change management lever on us to make sure we're being compliant. And therefore, we feel kind of dissociated and frustrated by what we're being told to do, because so often it feels like it's irrelevant to our context, our school, our community, our college. Now, change leadership is something very different. And change leadership for me, and this sounds like a soft word, but seriously, for me, it isn't, is actually about empowering our community of educators, as professionals, of administrators, of students, to be able to feel that they are active participants in the process of change, that they feel that they're at the cutting edge of it, that they're leading it, that actually, when you think about change, People aren't scared or disinterested in change when we feel we're active participants in it. What we find draining and exhausting is when we feel we're just running to clutch onto the
Mhm.
ideas being thrown at us. And so for me, what we've got to be doing is looking at how we create those cultures of action, research, opportunity, and time and energy for people to look above the parapet. Otherwise, what happens is we're exhausted just trying to stay afloat. And that's on top of all the emotional and administrative stuff that comes with our job of being educators. So, change leadership is about how do we help people create that culture of getting into the curve, at least if not ahead of it, to make sure we feel like we're active participants in a process rather than just constantly feel like we're victims of it, which often is where I see the difference between change leadership and change management.
Yeah, and I would say, roughly speaking, um, you can speak to the nuance of this, but there's some sort of a spectrum somewhere from resisting to reacting to accepting, enduring, managing, embracing, leading, right? Across the spectrum of how one would respond to change and then end up actually driving change. And somewhere in there, is the importance of anticipating changes that are happening environmentally, of determining a vision for what productive change would look like, and understanding that change will happen one way or another, right? And it either will happen to us and we're in the middle of that exhaustion, or, we are the ones who are leading the change. But something that you wrote about in your book, Change, a number of years ago, was that the rate of change is rapidly accelerating, right? More quickly than it ever has before. Change has always been a constant, but it's getting faster and faster, and that has only continued since you
Yeah.
wrote it, right? And would love to speak to, so that we can get to that point of anticipating and then really thinking about what a vision for effective change looks like. What are some of the factors right now that are really accelerating the rate of change and contributing to the constant state and need for leaders to really be mindful of changes that are occurring, how they're going to adopt those into their environments, how they're going to determine what works best, and to develop teams, et cetera, around that. But what are some of those key factors that are accelerating change right now?
Well, I mean, let's start with the kind of one front and center within education and use it as an exemplar, I guess, right? So if we take, because everybody is, and by the way, it strikes me that over the last 2 or 3 years, everyone in my field or has declared themselves to be an expert in artificial intelligence. Like everyone is now saying, I can tell you about AI. Again, I'm going to be a catalyst of confrontation. Where were those experts 10 years ago when AI was actually really beginning to surface, right? So let's use AI as maybe an exemplar here, and as probably the most profound catalyst of change and panic in the education space. And because it speaks to so much, really. You referred to the environmental shifts that are happening globally, which are in partnership with all of these things. And of course, AI is having a massive impact on the future jobs market, the world of work, which ultimately, whether we like it or not, and we could always talk about education being education for just purely the joy of education, but functionally, education is about preparing young people for the challenge of their future, right? So all of these profound things, if you stem it back to AI, and let's just take this back a couple of years, right? So AI has been buzzing around and has been changing technology for at least a decade, at least a decade. But it really came front and center in education when we discovered ChatGPT, what, 2.5, 3 years ago. Now, what happened at that point was really interesting because the reflex of policymakers around AI was, oh my God, kids are going to cheat in their essays. How do we stop kids cheating in their essays? How do we make sure we've got software to make sure they're not cheating and using Chat GPT to write their essays, right? That is reactive. That is reactive to change. And there is an element of that is important. The problem is that tends to be where we stop. Now, what's really important in the change process is having that short term conversation, but actually then activating the most important thing around change and being able to deal with it, which is our curiosity, right? So the stage two is then, okay, that's interesting. So we've got the short term challenges, but what are the long term opportunities here? What does AI actually tell us about the future and how we need to re-engineer education and use ChatGPT and artificial intelligence as a really powerful catalyst for change and transformation? So, for example, if ChatGPT can write base essays for our students in under 2 minutes, is that a problem? Or is the next question, how do we prepare kids to challenge, to interrogate, to question what ChatGPT pumps out? How do we get them to prove points? How do we get them to evidence what ChatGPT or otherwise? How do we get them to make sure that it's using what they actually wanted to say in the language they want to say it? How does that then free up time for those students to do more proactive research and learning in the same way that it does for educators, right? You've been in the ed tech space a lot longer than I have, Ross, but actually one of the main reasons for ed tech around administration is actually not how do we use tech to replace teachers or administrators. It's how do we use tech to free up time for educators and administrators to be more proactive. And I think to an extent, the missing link in that is this thing around curiosity. We deal with the short term stuff, and that always is what feels reactive, and it's always what takes energy. What we've got to do is then move on to step two, which is the curiosity stuff, which is about being proactive, is about being provocative and saying, okay, but how do we see this as an opportunity, right? And I think so much of what we see then in society is us so exhausted and our political leaders promising us quick fix solutions to the reactive stuff, whether it's environmental, geopolitical, economic, technological, right? And what that stopped us doing is going, okay, so this is the state of the world. What are not just what do we have to deal with here in the short term, but what are the big questions we should now be asking to find how we use this stuff positively and constructively to change the future?
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, as you're kind of talking through that about as leaders in organizations, um, how much of the determination about what change should look like and how uh, we change our footing from being in that reactive, responsive position where it feels like the change is coming at us and we're just doing the best we can to facilitate it, right, as best we can, or to limit the damage, to being more, leading a particular vision for proactive change. How much of it comes down to identity and opportunity, right? Like one, really understanding the identity of what our organization is, what we want it to look like, what we stand for, what's our purpose. So in schools, really anchoring one around students and the world that they're inheriting and what we want to do to prepare them for their future and what are the things that do that. And there's a variety of different ways, right? And then within our school organization, for example, what do we feel like are the best ways we know how to prepare for that? And then seeing where the opportunities are, because realistically, right, depending on the scenario, take cheating as an example, right? Anything can be viewed this way or that way. We have our friend joining us from Scotland. Golf carts. Sometimes it's cheating to use a golf cart, right? Sometimes it's not, right? It's a matter of environment and circumstance. Calculators, once upon a time, right, would have been a cheating tool. In some instances, they still may be, but also they're a tool that's used. I mean, I don't know if these are great examples, but the point being that leaders have to really proactively develop the vision for what is our organization, what do we stand for, what are we trying to accomplish, how are we providing effective policies, guidance, around what that looks like, whether that relates to the use of technology or any other initiatives we want to put in place. That it's not, oh, this one size fits all. It's identifying what are the opportunities to move toward the vision that we have, right, for our identity as an organization.
And I think, you know, so much of that, you're talking to PD, professional development, as much as anything, right? And the guilt complex we inherently feel as educators. You know, most educators feel guilty if they ever take a second off to reflect on something, to experience something new or different, to read a book that isn't, God forbid, just a book on how to be a better school leader or educator. So what tends to happen is we live in echo chambers, and that's not a criticism, right? That's because we care so much. And we tend to be focused all the time on our community, our children, our school, which is absolutely right. And you wouldn't want an educator to be any other way. But the problem then is partly our professional development, which comes back to what I said right at the beginning, which is about management, because most people's experience of professional development in education is how do I become more efficient at what I already do? So if I'm a math teacher, I go on courses to be better at teaching the syllabus that I have to teach or preparing students to take tests. You know, if I'm a physical education teacher, I go on courses to learn how to deliver the physical education syllabus better than I do already. So much of it is around efficiency. In terms of education leadership, a lot of the courses and professional development I see on an education leadership aren't about education leadership at all. They're about how do I become a better manager? Now, all of those things are important. But if we're serious about getting ahead of the change curve, we have to look at professional development as a really serious tool to help us extend our context and our knowledge. Otherwise, we live in our echo chamber of education. You know, it fascinates me that when we have conversations and debate about the future of education, most of the people having those conversations live every hour of every day in education. I remember interviewing a number of years ago, and stick with me on this, guys. I hope you'll see the relevance, right? An extraordinary man called Barry Barish, who was the 2017 Nobel Prize winner for physics for his work into gravitational waves. And I remember asking him about what he was looking for in the people he was bringing into his research team. So how on earth do you go about bringing research scientists? Where are you looking? What are you looking for? And people ultimately who go on to change the world and the perception of it because they win a Nobel Prize for really, you know, changing the paradigm. And he said something that I will never forget. He said, you know, Richard, in a way, people's qualifications by the time we're looking for them are almost irrelevant, right? They've all done the same thing on paper. He said the challenge actually is if you're looking to challenge a paradigm, if you're looking to be, if you're looking to evolve, to really transform people's thinking and behavior and actions, you can't put people in a room who have all done the same thing through most of their career because no matter how talented, smart, clever they are, right, they will be breathing increasingly stale air because they all come from a similar background. He said, what you need are people that think three-dimensionally. And when he was explaining that, as well as recruiting people that just had fascinating life backstories, he said something that I think is the most poetic and beautiful thing I've ever heard anyone say about professional, well, human development. And that was, I was looking for people who had the courage to challenge the beauty of the proof. So I need people that can come in here and see the world differently from the way I do and question why I see it the way I do. And I think professional development in our school communities can be a really powerful lever for that. You know, rather than always sending a math teacher on a math course, why not send them to spend, if we've got the budget, or even, you know, this is where the entrepreneurship of leadership comes in, go and get them to spend a day working in a local business, understanding how that business applies mathematics in real contexts, whether it's a retail business or a financial services organization or a tech company. Get them to actually see the application of the subject in real context, because that'll spark new thinking in the way they see the world, and it'll help them understand how to author what that math might look like syllabus wise in a classroom for students. Because what we've got to remember is Education is not simply the pursuit of an academic process. But we can't expect educators to understand and see that if they don't get experience outside of their own contexts.
Right.
So if you take that to leadership and a leadership level, one of the things, again, education leaders feel really guilty about is not spending every hour of every day in their school or college community just dealing with the problems, right? Because we feel that's our duty. But actually, to go and spend half a day a year looking and just shadowing a leader in an entirely different sector, an entirely different type of organization, to just without an agenda go and see what they do, how they handle human relationships, conflict, proactivity, planning, professional development. You know, those things can be so incredibly enlightening. And when I look back on my leadership at Grange and people say to me, how did you come up with the ideas that the school community came up with? We sent teachers to go and experience things in a wider context, to see, you know, if I had a literacy English teacher, I went and sent them to spend a day with the BBC, understanding how the BBC communicate with their public. You know, if I myself went to spend a day at the Microsoft campus in the UK, which is in Reading, not far from London, to understand how they stimulate creative process under the most intense pressure and how the physical environment helps to create and stimulate that. And when I look back on those opportunities, they were by far the most powerful professional development opportunities I had or my colleagues had in actually delivering a better learning experience for our students.
Yeah. I'd love to go to who's involved in the change process. And we have a similar question in the chat, so it's a perfect time to transition into that. And I guess I would ask it as who's involved, right? As the leader, who do you need to get involved? When do you get them involved in the process? And then what does it look like? And how do you define it? Do you define it as gaining buy-in, as delegating or deputizing, as co-creating? Right? How do you define that process of identifying the stakeholders, getting them involved, and then, moving forward together?
I think so much of that as a leader starts with both an understanding and clarity of the vision and values and where you need to get to in big picture stuff. And it's also about talent management, right? Now, we hear the term talent management a lot. And again, I have real issues. We should be looking at talent leadership. And of course, one of the great things we know about great leaders, and that's true of the education space of anywhere else, is if you ask them about the people that they have direct leadership for, they will tell you the positives, negatives, quirks about each and every one of those people. They'll know what their hobbies are. They'll know what their passions are, what their weaknesses are, what their strengths are. And I think so much of what we need to do in education context is harvest that knowledge and use it, the right place, right time, whether it's really basic stuff. I remember when I started as a school principal, I think the thing that was giving me the most sleepless nights before I started the job was the fact I was going to have to lead on the budget. It was my, responsibility, my fiduciary responsibility that I, as the school principal, had ultimate sign off on a budget. Now, if you knew me properly, Ross, you would know that I'm not even allowed to run the budget in my own house, let alone a multi-million-dollar budget in a school community. But during my interviews early on with my staff, one member of staff was very clearly passionate about money, really understood money, really understood budgeting, did stock market trading, did all sorts of things in their own spare time. So I took him aside very early on in my tenure and said, how would you feel if I give you the space and time of managing the budget on our behalf? I would obviously but that's where your talent and you love it. And his eyes lit up, right? His eyes lit. He went, oh my God, I've never wanted a leadership position in a school. He was the math coordinator, loved teaching, passionate about it. But he said, oh my God, I would love to be involved in that. That's really something that makes my heart beat faster, right? So finding the right people in the right place at the right time is one thing. And as a leader, investing in truly understanding each and every individual, because the second point is You never know where the talent lies, right? The talent could lie in your school kitchens, where the person comes in every day to chop the salad. Do you know what their passions are, what they get up to in their own time? Do they have a passion for reading or sports, and how could you exploit that and use it to actually benefit them as well as your community? So that talent leadership is a really important piece. I think in terms of understanding, if you have a big, broad vision, and you mentioned it in the introduction at Grange, one of the reasons why I was called the Walt Disney of the classroom, which was a kind of typical national media headline in a national paper once, was because, and it goes back, I remember walking into one of my first staff meetings. By then, I really understood some of the challenges of our community, and our community over 10 years had become um, there was no context for the learning either for the staff or the kids, right? The staff were told, do this because we tell you to, and if you implement it properly, you might be saved, your job might be saved, your school might be saved. Just do what we tell you. Shut up, here's the syllabus, deliver it. And the kids, and we all know children, doesn't matter what age they are not stupid, right? The kids knew that they weren't being taught by people who cared about what they were teaching. The kids didn't care about it because it had no context. We were in a socially deprived community where the idea, for example, of going to college or a job in a really cool professional setting was way beyond anything these kids had had any experience of, and therefore was totally irrelevant to them. There was no context for that opportunity and development. And so, when you're thinking then about change, when you're thinking about what we need to do, you have to create the big vision. And the Walt Disney thing was, I said to our staff, how do we create an environment that is exciting as Disney World? In other words, how do we create an environment where kids will do stuff they don't want to? And for any of us that have been to Disney in Orlando or slightly less so California, kids are made to queue up for hours on end in ridiculous heat. Queuing is something kids hate, right? But you take them to Disney and they will go through the hard yards of queuing for 2 hours to see a fake Nordic princess because of what's at the end of the experience for them, right? And then what you find is, having queued for 2 hours and had that experience, the first thing kids say is, can we do it again? Right.
Mhm.
So I wanted to create an environment that was so connected, so contextual, so rich in its experience. Kids would still go through the hard yards of learning and the tough stuff of struggling to overcome something they don't know or understand. And the same for the teachers. But by creating that, we then came out with a 3-word vision. And that was, everything at Grange will be rooted in living life, a celebration of how learning can help people live a better and more extraordinary life. Learning itself for the purity and power of learning and the joy that can give you. And ultimately, laughter, because living and learning, if you do it right, creates a really happy and positive, constructive space. So then what we did was we created professional development opportunities and development opportunities along rich context. How do we create a Disney World environment for our learning? And then it was about opening up the opportunity for my staff and people in the community to come and have ideas. So my door was open, because the other thing we have to do is shift the idea that the leader is the one that has to be the one that comes up with the solutions and the ideas. Our job is to ensure that the vision and values are integral to what we're doing and why we're doing it. Our job is to help harvest the talent, but also to put the ideas out there to actually be the catalysts for other people to find the solutions. And I think one of the things we have to do as leaders is give ourselves the permission to move away from believing our job is to solve the problems to creating the context for our community to solve the problems.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good example. I had the exact experience a month ago of going to Disney with a 5-year-old and thinking, I wonder how this is going to go with these lines, and didn't get one complaint, right? Because it was designed appealingly, and we, there was something good at the end of that line. I'm wondering relatedly about and explicitly about strategies for leading by example.
Hmm.
One thing that I think is interesting that you've said before is that change and leading change is different than getting better at what you've always done, which makes sense when you hear it, but it might not be obvious, right, or implied. Um, but a big part of that being as the leader, being willing to stretch and grow and change and actually demonstrate that by example, that it's not just about setting up a system and a process.
I think, and this stems back to my time as a teacher because I think it's the same thing. One of my favorite books growing up, and please don't judge me for this, everybody, was The Great Gatsby by your author F. Scott Fitzgerald. And what I loved about it the first time I read it was the first time I'd read a book with what they call a fallible narrator. And if you remember, Nick, who was the narrator in the book, for those of you that read it, was fallible in that he wasn't like this just omnipresent, objective teller of a story. He actually had his own frailties, weaknesses, made bad moves, bad decisions. He was fallible, right? And I think looking back on it now, the reason why I loved the book was because he was human. He was real. He was organic. And he wasn't just this perfect, omnipresent figure, like a godlike figure. And I think when I became a teacher, that became very prevalent to me very early on, very resonant, in that I was teaching kids, as I've said before, in tough communities. And the danger of being a middle class guy going into a school community and just being the purveyor of knowledge and look at me, I'm the middle class bloke you should all be trying to be. The problem for a lot of those kids is they were looking at me, many of whom, by the way, didn't have positive male role models in their lives, going, that's unobtainable. I can't be you. I'm not as smart as you. I'm not going to, even though I wasn't that, you know what I mean? It's a barrier, right? And so
Mhm.
I often used to say to teachers, because I did it as a teacher, be fallible. Make mistakes in front of the kids. Look stupid. Trip up. Make be the one the kids go, oh, come on, sir, that's completely ridiculous. Look, you've got that wrong. Be that person. Be the catalyst. Because if you do that and you're fallible, you become relatable. If you become relatable, the kids can build a relationship and a bond with you because they see you as a human being. And I think the same thing is true of leaders. If what we do, and the pressure is immense all the time to be the perfect leader, to have to be in control, to know the answers, because people think, oh, as the leader, everyone needs to just go, oh God, we trust her, we trust him. They're in control all the time. At least that is really, really difficult then for people. And what we have to do is be the first to admit our weaknesses, occasionally be the first to admit our fears, our lack of understanding, our lack of knowledge. Going back to the story I said about getting the guy to do the budget, being able to turn around because he saw this new leader come in. And the first thing I said to him was, you are way better at this than I am. Right, the budget makes me feel physically sick setting a budget, and he immediately warmed to me because I wasn't a leader that had gone in there to pretend to know I knew the community, I knew the school, I knew the finances, I was going to be the hero leader. I went in there and showed my weaknesses. And what that did was twofold. One, it made him feel more comfortable about admitting his weaknesses, about me respecting his strengths, and him realizing where my strengths were and being prepared to accept those. So I think as a leader, just like as an educator, we have to be prepared to be vulnerable. We have to be prepared to be fallible. And if we set those behaviors, then actually it's a really powerful way of building a culture which allows others to be honest. Because it's that honesty at the heart of our organizations that allow us to embrace that change process, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, I think as we are transitioning to our next few topics here in the last 10 15 minutes, it's a good time to touch on another question we got in the chat about some of the specific levers you pulled to improve your school quickly in that school leadership. Some of the first things you put in place or changed, as you've just referenced one of them, right? Which I think illustrates the the role of self-awareness, right? Knowing your own strengths, interests, where you're going to do your best work, getting stakeholders directly involved in a meaningful, concrete way, right? And giving them things that apply to their strengths and interests. And that was, a tangible example. Are there other things along those lines that in that initial period, as you were looking at what I'm sure felt like an overwhelming endeavor, young school leader, a school that was having challenges, to say, all right, that first 3 6 months, that's a critical period because how am I going to show up as a leader? What are they going to see me as? Right? Am I going to earn their trust? And then also, are we going to show that we're making progress? And that requires, okay, let's have a few specifics that we're doing here to show everybody we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there are so many. And by the way, I'm not trying to create a sales pitch, but it's still available digitally. If people want to know the story in more detail, my first book, Creating Tomorrow's Schools Today, can do the question you've just asked me much more justice than we can in the few minutes we have, because you can imagine there's so much to share. But let me start at one of the points that has always fascinated me, and it takes me back to my own background in drama and performance and the arts. I've always believed, and it also links to one of the great challenges at Grange, which was the context for learning. Why learn? Why are we learning? Why is this important? And one of the things that I think is horrendously under appreciated, I think, and not respected as much as it should be in education, because education policy and education models tend to be top down. In other words, most education policy in most countries is defined by universities and education publishers and pushed downwards. And I actually think the finest models of learning I've ever seen occur in early years education. I remember when I trained as a teacher, one of my lecturers saying, and I don't know how he percentaged it, but the sentiment is definitely right. He said we learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lifetime before we're 5 years old. Now, that always blew my mind. And then when I was lucky enough to see really great early years practice, very pragmatic, hands-on, experiential, kids learning at a really, accelerated rate and often complex stuff. But because it was so pragmatic, because it was so contextual, learning at an extraordinary rate and retaining that knowledge and those skills. For me, early years practice was very much core to the philosophy of what we were going to do at Grange. So I wanted to, rather than do top down, I wanted to say, how could we learn lessons from our early years department and early years practice and push it upwards? How could we, rather than redefining education and putting kids behind desks with a teacher at the front of the classroom and just doing by rote learning, how could we really utilize that power and expertise of early years practice? And by doing that, we did a number of things. Firstly, I think fundamentally, if a school community appreciates its early years practitioners who are exceptional, they give even more. And they have so much knowledge, wit, and wisdom to share upwards and outwards. So immediately you start to build a critical mass and a positive movement in the earliest years of your community and your foundation. And then what happens is you start to deploy that knowledge and that experience upwards, fundamentally asking really interesting questions. And teachers higher up the school, penny starts to drop and they go, I could use that. I could, not all the time, but I could utilize that in my practice. And I would love to share that idea. You start to create a community of learners who are doing something for the first time that is proactive. Now, I could have just gone into that community and said, we've got to get our test scores up by 20, 30, 40%. And people would have immediately heads down, do what we've always done, try and do it more efficiently. Or what we did was shift the narrative and change the expertise and create something really interesting and fundamental and dynamic that shifted people's experiences really quickly, that got them asking the curious questions, that got them delving into practice and how to activate that practice in meaningful and new ways, that created action research because then people were feeding back in a really interesting action research loop that created a really accelerated journey. Now, because the kids very quickly started to go, oh God, now I understand why math is important. Now I understand why reading is important, or writing, or science is important. And again, I could please get people to go onto YouTube or to read the book, because they'll see how that really crystallized in pragmatic terms. But to give people an example, right? We wanted our kids to get really into science and literacy. So we created a television studio. One, because kids running their own television shows was really sexy. But what better way to learn about light reflection and refraction than lighting a TV studio, or sound waves and visual waves? What better way in literacy than making literacy important than teaching kids they have to be literate to be able to read and write scripts in order to be able to be part of a television station, than doing those things. And so suddenly you open kids' eyes, you give teachers the opportunity to be creative, you're sticking to the fundamentals but delivering them in an entirely new and novel way. And by doing that, the take-up rate from our students in learning was what led to the profound transformation.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left here. I'd love to get to just a couple more things, one of which is the inspiration we can take from our youngest learners
Yeah.
when it comes to change. I would love to have you share that with our participants.
It goes back to something I just said, really, Ross. Go back to the quote from my lecturer. We learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lifetime before we're five. And those of us that have been privileged enough to work with kids under five, have kids of our own, or kids in our family or friendship group who are under five, will know how extraordinary those young people are. And actually, how they crave change and uncertainty almost constantly. Because if they're made to do the same thing, you've got a 5-year-old, right? If your child is made to do the same thing in the same way for more than 5 minutes, they will drive you crazy, right?
Mm.
They're constantly questioning, but why, daddy? But why? But how? But what? But what? But why? But how? But what if I touch this, or put this in my mouth, or what if I walk over there and do? And it's exhausting for us as adults. But the point is, it comes down to curiosity, and it goes to where my piece of work in life is going next, which is an exploration of curiosity. And I think the fascination to me is, why are we so curious so young, and where does that curiosity go as we get older? Because I'm yet to meet an 18-month-old child who is going through therapy because they can't cope with the rate of change and uncertainty in their life, right? Those kids just absorb and take it on and learn and question more, challenge more, have unbelievable momentum. So what can we learn from kids under five? Being more curious, asking more fundamental questions, right? Questioning what we think is obvious. So you take that right up to, and I'll try and be as objective as I can politically right now. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing such a mess globally in politics right now with the rise of populism is people just want somebody to deliver an answer to them. And we're not curious enough. We're not asking enough questions. But why? But what? But how? And I think if we could learn some of that from young kids in so many aspects of our lives, we could start to feel more in control of what life is throwing to us as adults. Because in many ways, it's no more daunting than what it's like to be a 2, 3-year-old child having new stuff thrown at them every minute of every day.
Yeah. Let's wrap up by underlining the stakes one more time, right? That if we fail to change, if we fail to navigate change effectively and bring our education organizations into, modern times, but also future forward, um, we risk leaving kids behind, right?
Yeah.
And um, especially as compared to their peers in other places that are navigating change more effectively, right? Or in terms of the economy, really the economy globally, and within each individual region and nation. Um, I guess can you kind of close by just giving us another view at that perspective about why this is so important, especially for those who are in education to really take seriously why being change leaders is such a critical part of education leadership, given what the role of education is.
Sure. I mean, look, fundamentally, selfishly, as an educator, it's about our own self-preservation and energy. Because if we continue to try and cling on to Usain Bolt's coattails, the rate of burnout is only just going to continue to increase. The mental health problems amongst our educators and our education community is going to increase. We've got to put the brakes on and find the courage to say that we have to be active in finding another way. Um, and there are brilliant examples out there. For our students, let me give you one really sobering example. About 18 months ago, I went and ran a session for the global graduate entry group of one of the big five accountancy firms. I don't want to name them specifically, but one of the big five. We're talking about those. So we're talking about, if you like, the blue chip employers for most aspirational parents and kids. And I said to the woman, the director who was designing and running the overall program, I said to her, "What is your biggest challenge?" She said, "Richard, this latest group of intake, the last few groups of intakes are technically and technologically some of the most advanced new employees we've had. They're extraordinary. What they can do with tech is remarkable." She said, "The problem is that increasingly, and in an age of AI and tech, our clients expect human relationships and human interaction at the heart of that." She said, "We have never had more ill-prepared young people to deal with the human side of their jobs, and most of them are terrified about getting away from a computer, a laptop, a tablet, and actually building human relationships." So one of the things we have to do is understand that simply training technically or for knowledge or all of that stuff for all kinds of reasons, partly because AI can give you that answer in a millisecond better than we could, partly I remember talking to a corporate lawyer a couple of years ago who said the biggest impact on AI will be the number of jobs for corporate lawyers in the world, because when you're putting together a corporate contract, which can be hundreds, thousands of pages long, usually the difference between corporate contracts is about 2 to 4% of the content. And we have to, at the moment, have a team of lawyers to go through every single word on every single sentence on every single page to find that nuance and that difference. AI will be able, when it becomes more accurate, to do that in less than 5 minutes for a contract. We won't need that team of lawyers anymore, right? So what we've got to stop doing is believing as educators that if we just do what we've always done more efficiently, we will prepare kids for the world. We are simply wrong. I think it was Toffler who coined the phrase, "If we continue to educate the way we are, we will elegantly prepare children for a world that no longer exists." That's happening now, right? That's on one level. What we have to do is not try and work out what the world will be. What we have to do is educate kids to deal with uncertainty and change better than we have, and to see them as opportunity. And that means we need to develop proactive learners, questioning and curious learners, not learners who believe that somebody else will find the answer for them and tell them when they've found it. We will also have to create an education system which is much more human focused, which is much more about human relationships and interactions. And I think, finally, on that note, from me, what we have to do is open up the conversation to ensure that we as educators are always looking at what the future might be, and we're open to having conversations with people outside of education to create that system. Otherwise, blandly, the polarization and anger we're seeing in so many countries right now, particularly interestingly, the most developed countries, is because people feel disenfranchised. They feel they were lied to. They feel that the education system ill prepared them for the world they're now living in, with all of the maelstrom that we talked about earlier. And the world will just become angrier. We have to create a more proactive community of people if we're truly to help prepare them for the maelstrom of the world as it's going to be. And we need to stop believing if we do what we've always done more efficiently, that world will go away and the storm will calm. The storm's not going to calm. We've got to build new ships.
Excellent. Well, yeah, to relate it to exactly what we've been seeing and focusing on here, you referenced what you've heard from employers, and that's what we've seen broadly that typically of the top skills that employers are looking for, 7 out of the top 10 are what we categorize as those durable skills: communication, critical thinking, right? Creativity, those 4 C's, those types of skills that are going to be durable and applicable across different domains, and really the future ready skills to prepare young people to be able to thrive within the workforce and the economy, right? Not those technical skills, which are also important, but almost a given in some fields, right? That's the baseline expectation. But how do we apply this? And that's why we've embedded those skills in our college and career readiness, or university and career readiness, depending on where you are, curriculum, and the end-to-end program there, because of how important they are, in addition to the identification of a specific career pathway, post-secondary education, and so on. So, participants, as we referenced earlier, you will get the recording of this conversation via email. If you are interested in learning more, have questions, want to know about additional resources, one thing that's really easy that you can do is just reply directly to that email, and we'll get you in touch with somebody who can help. You can visit our website just to see more about the various programs that we have at Edmentum. You could also learn more about Richard, his books, his podcast, the other work he's doing at his website, richardgerver.com. So all of that will come to you via email. You can check it all out. We really appreciate all of you being here. Thank you for joining us for this. And Richard, I thank you for being here.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time, and thank you, Ross, for inviting me.